Hello everyone, and welcome to GeoGuessr Deconstructed. Today we are looking at the United States of America. The USA is debatably the third largest country in the world. There's some discrepancies over measurements between it and China, namely with territorial waters, but for simplicity let's call it the third largest country. It is also the third most populous country in the world. In case you don't know where the US is, it is on the North American continent, right in the middle, just between Canada and Mexico. The USA consists of 50 states, one federal district, that being a District of Columbia or Washington, D.C., and 6 territories that have relevant Google Maps coverage, those being the Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, Puerto Rico, the Midway Atoll, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and American Samoa. However, those will be in their own videos. The ones in the Caribbean will be in the Caribbean video, and the ones in the Pacific will be in the Pacific video. The most populous cities in the U.S. are New York, which is located on the East Coast over here, Chicago, which is in Illinois in the Midwest, and Los Angeles, which is in the lower part of California on the West Coast. The internet domain code for the US is .us, though this is basically never seen, and typically you'll see things like .com, .org, .net, just what you would typically expect from a website. In terms of Google Maps coverage, as you can see here, basically everything is covered. If there's a road, it's probably covered. There's some more sparse parts in the western half of the country, but that's just because fewer people live there and there's just no roads. The only real exception to this is Alaska. The western half of the state is pretty much uncovered by Google Maps. There aren't many people that live there anyways, so that makes sense. Looking at a terrain map of the country, there are 3 main features. There's the western half of the country, which is pretty dominated by mountains, these being the Rocky Mountains, as well as Nevada, kind of being peppered with pretty high elevation area. There's the Great Plains, or the middle of the country, which is almost entirely flat. And then on the eastern half of the country, we have the Appalachian Mountains, where, while they're not as large as the Rockies, are still pretty prevalent in the areas. In terms of camera generations that are covered, the US is almost entirely covered in Gen 3 and Gen 4 camera. Gen 1 can be seen, which is actually a pretty good indicator that you are in the United States. The only other countries that really have any prevalent Gen 1 are Australia, and Gen 2 is almost never seen. This is another main indicator to separate it from Canada, which does have a lot more Gen 2. An exception, again, is kind of Alaska. From what I've seen, there is a good amount of Gen 2 still in Alaska, but overall, you won't see that in the US. The US actually does not have an official language, though English is the most used and is effectively the de facto language of the country. However, you can also see some bilingual signs or exclusively Spanish signs. In this case, we are in Los Angeles, California. You can see things like this closer to the Mexico border, so places like Southern California, Southern Texas, and Southern Florida. Because a lot of the population in the country does speak Spanish, this can be found anywhere. I wasn't able to find any concrete examples, but the northern part of Maine has a fairly high French-speaking population. This is likely because of its location near Quebec and New Brunswick. So that might be something to keep in mind as well. You can also find some native languages, such as Navajo, here on this pretty unique stop sign in the Navajo Nation in northern Arizona. There is also native land across the country, so you may see some native languages there as well. Some other general identification for the US is the presence of the double yellow line. This is also present in Canada and some of the South American countries, but it can be found here as well. As mentioned in the Canada video, one way to separate those two countries apart is the Gen 3 car blur, where Canada has 2 of these little blurred humps where the mirrors would be, and the US only has 1. So distinguishing Canada and the US can also be down to the Gen 3 car blur. There are also several states that have wider yellow lines, so the gap in between the 2 lines is a lot wider than you see here. Those include states like Texas, Oregon, Washington, Iowa, Arkansas, and a couple others. There are also, I believe, a couple of states that have thick yellow lines, most notably West Virginia. The general signage that you'll see in the US are these green signs with white lettering and white arrows on them. These are most seen on highways and often feature the road number or location that you're going to go to. As for the numbering of exits, a majority of states use the distance-based approach. As you can see, this is exit 880, which is on the eastern side of Texas along I-10. In the states that do have this distance-based approach, the highest numbers will be seen on the east and also on the south. So on the west side of Texas, on I-10, you will see exit 1. American speed limit signs use the word speed limit and often have their number ending with a 5 as they use miles per hour. This, I believe, is also the highest posted speed limit in the country. This is found on a toll road near Austin, Texas. 85 miles an hour here is equivalent to about 137 kilometers per hour. The chevron that is used in the United States is the same as Canada. It is a black arrow on a yellow background. Pedestrian signs are typically also black on yellow, and American signs typically have words in them. So in this case, this one-way sign has the word one way in them. In Canada, it would just be the arrow. When looking at the specific state roads of each state, just about every state has their own unique shield or just sign of what their state road is. This infographic shows here, everything colored in red is a unique design. There are some that just have the state name on them. There are some that are not unique, like the circles and squares, mostly in the Northeast, and a couple have a very unique design to them, such as the sunflower in Kansas and the beehive in Utah. There are a couple here that have been updated, most notably North Dakota, but the North Dakota state road sign still says North Dakota on it, even after the update. These are the shields or symbols of a couple different types of roads found in the US. In the top left here is specifically New York's state road. On the right is the Pentagon blue county road sign. This is not unique to New York. This can be seen all over the country. So just because you see a Pentagon county road sign does not mean you're in any specific location. It's worth noting that counties are often irrespective of any cities that are found in them. Sometimes you do have a given city in a county, but a lot of times the county name does not reflect what cities are found inside of it. There's also the US route system, which is similar to the highways and use this white shield, as opposed to the blue interstate shield. You do occasionally see this business interstate sign. This is just another part of the interstate system, so in this case this would be found on Interstate 35. The US also uses miles, as mentioned earlier. In terms of signage, there is exactly one exception where the US uses kilometers posted. This is found on Interstate 19, just south of Tucson, Arizona, and goes to the Mexico border. These use kilometers because at the time the interstate was being built, the US had a push towards the metric system, which never went through, but these signs were still made as they were still built to spec. One last thing about interstates, you may be familiar with this image from a CGP Grey video on the numbering of the US's interstate systems. So all of the general north-south facing roads, so in this case I-5, I-15, 25, etc., they all have or end in odd numbers. The largest of which are the 5s, so again, 5, 15, 25, 35, you get the point. Same with the even numbers. All even number interstates generally trend east to west, and the numbers increase from south to north. So for example, Interstate 10 is the lowest interstate, then 20, then 30, then 40, going more north from there. There is also the presence of 3-digit interstates. So for example, around Los Angeles, we have the interstates 105, 405, 110, 710, 605, things like that. For these, the first digit really doesn't matter too much. The next 2 digits are what that feeder highway basically turn into. So for example, Interstate 110 goes into Interstate 10. Interstate 105 goes into Interstate 5, you get the idea. These are not location specific, so you may see multiple interstates 710, say, in multiple states, but in this example, you'll know that you are on a spur of Interstate 10. The US routes also follow a similar numbering scheme, except they are reversed. So in this case, Route 1 is located on the East Coast, on the east side of Maine, and Route 1 goes all the way down to Key West on the bottom of Florida. Likewise, we have Route 98 on the bottom of Florida here as well. But as you can see, the numbering here is a lot more fluid than the actual interstate system. So we have Route 41, which is just its own route, basically converges with Route 1 in the same place. So you can get a general idea of where each route is, but exactly where it will be in the country is kind of inconsistent. The US routes also use the 3-digit system, but again, this is kind of inconsistent. But the US routes also follow the east-west are even and north-south are odd system. Finally, out of roads, let's take a look at license plates. Similar to Canada, and as we'll see eventually Mexico, the US uses the short plate. Every state has their own design for the plate, but because cars travel so frequently, even more so than usual in the US, the plates that you see may not be the most accurate to where you are. So, especially if you're playing a moving game, check multiple plates to see if they're the same, and then from there you can make your guess. This infographic shows which states require front plates and which ones don't. Unlike Canada, I feel like it's easier to remember which states do not have front plates as opposed to which do. So in this case, everything in the light green color does not use a front plate, and everything in blue does. For me, the easiest way to remember which states do not have a front plate are everything on the south coast, basically, of the country, except for California and Texas, which are the two largest states. And then you can basically just make a straight line up from Alabama. Everything up until Michigan also does not have a front plate. And then there's a little spur of West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. But again, because cars travel so much, you'll probably see cars without front plates in states that do require them, and vice versa. Plunkett has a great guide, which I will link in the description, as for which US states' license plates are the easiest to learn. There are some that I disagree with, so for example, I feel like Idaho is very easy to learn, because it's basically just the Netherlands flag, or the sideways French flag, where you can see a red stripe, a white stripe, and a blue stripe. But some, such as Vermont, which is all green, Delaware, which is all black, and the older New York plates, which are all in a dark orange color, are all very easy to recognize. One other note to make is that several countries look very, very similar under a blur. So in this case, Connecticut, which is up on top here, Illinois, which is under the somewhat easy to learn section, and Minnesota, which is on the right here, all basically look the same with a blur. They have a top half of blue and a bottom half of white, so use other clues before just blindly going off of the license plate. Also, a lot of US license plates are basically just white, so they're not really that helpful. One other thing in distinguishing the US from other countries, especially in more rural areas, is the width of the road. So there are a lot of pickup trucks and just very wide vehicles in the US, so a lot of roads, especially more rural ones, are just very, very wide. Compare this to this road, which can be found in Czechia. The rural road here is very narrow. If you look down, the road is basically just as wide as the one car. So this is a pretty good idea of at least North America, as Canada does have these wide roads as well. Some other things that you'll see in the US are rumble strips on the side of roads. These are basically just divots dug into the concrete, just to indicate drivers that they're about to run off the road. Again, these can also be found in Canada. There are also these white and orange, they're not bollards, but they're basically just posts in the ground. These are indicative of fiber lines that are buried in the ground, and are typically only seen in the US. You can see them in Canada and Mexico too, but they are much rarer. Next we have the state flags. So every state also has their own unique flag. Unfortunately, for identification purposes, a lot of these are the state seal on a blue background. So especially if they're folded up or not entirely visible, they're very, very difficult to distinguish. However, some such as Colorado, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and a couple others are all very distinguishable. Some states, most particularly Texas, are very big fans of their flag and basically just post it wherever they are, or hang it up, so these ones are good to know. So finally, let's take a look at the regions of the country. So first will be the Pacific Northwest, which for the purposes of this video, I'll be considering as Washington, the western half of Oregon, Northern California, the northern bit of Idaho, and a little bit of Montana. This region is probably best categorized by the presence of these fir trees here. So in this case, this is a location in Washington, and there are just plenty of fir trees all the way down the road and all around. Here's another location in northern Idaho, and again, we can see pretty similar fir trees in this forested area. And again, in Oregon, pretty much the similar fir trees that you'd see in this entire region. So where we are now is coastal Oregon. This is a little bit different, as I believe it is officially categorized as a temperate rainforest. To distinguish this, you do still have these fir trees, but you also have a lot of ferns growing on the ground here, and some more of these broader leafed trees. These fir trees and trees that look like this do exist throughout the country, but the Pacific Northwest has a lot of them and is probably the best indicator for that region. But of course, use your other clues if you can. California is one of the largest states in the country, and because of that, it has a lot of different climates and features. So the first and probably the easiest way to identify the state as a whole are these 3 yellow strips that are found on power poles. While these can be found in neighboring states, I would say that probably 99.5% of the time you're going to be in California, and you can probably use some other clues to determine that. California also very often features this black line in between their yellow lines. This is basically just a line of tar, and I believe it's used to increase visibility at night. Again, this can be found in other states, but often it is in California. Coastal California, and for that matter, coastal of most of the country, can be categorized by just the presence of palm trees. There are palm trees all around here, this really funky tree, which I don't know what it is, and just a general beach vibe. I mean, in this case, we are basically on the beach. This location is in San Diego, California. Just all the palm trees kind of just gives away that we're at least near some coast. As a major departure from that, we have the California desert. This can be found in the east and southeast part of the state, and is just a desert. This region does look like a lot of the regions surrounding it, most notably Nevada and western Arizona. So again, use your other clues before making a guess. Not very far away from the desert, we have the mountain area of California. So this is located northwest of Los Angeles for this mountain range specifically, and is really just mountains. It's relatively dry, not really too much in terms of trees or foliage, but it kind of just looks like the western US, I would say. But if you don't really know what that looks like, you will have to use your other clues. Finally, in terms of mostly unique regions for California, we have the Valley, so often known as the Napa Valley or places like that. This is a Mediterranean vibe. You can find this between the mountains, right in the middle of California. So as you can see, a lot of lower lying trees. Oftentimes you'll see wineries or maybe even olive trees. Kind of just what you would expect from the Mediterranean area. So just as a recap for California, we have the northern part, which was covered in the Pacific Northwest region, the coast, which is the coast, the desert, which is just this southeastern section here mostly. It does kind of lead into the Great Basin, which we will get to in just a minute, especially with Death Valley. The mountains, which are a lot of the state, but in specific, I looked at this little ridge above Los Angeles and just this region here. And then the valley, which is where Sacramento, Stockton, Modesto, this whole region is. One final and pretty interesting thing about California is Mount Whitney, which can be found over here, and Death Valley, which can be found over here, are both the tallest and lowest points in the contiguous 48, and they are just about 100 miles away from each other. This is just something that I find pretty interesting. Both the highest and lowest points of the country, excluding Alaska, are so close together. The next region is the Great Basin. The Great Basin is called this because there are no outlets to the ocean, so it is a very, very dry region. This region is basically southeastern Oregon, southwestern Idaho, pretty much all of Nevada, and then western Utah in this section right around the west of the Great Salt Lake. Other than being very dry, the Great Basin consists of a lot of mountains. As we saw in the terrain map, Nevada is basically peppered with elevation changes all over. So these mountains can be seen pretty much all around where you are. Another view here in western Utah, kind of the same, just a lot of mountains, very dry, a lot of sand, not a lot of foliage as well. Moving a bit more east, we have the Rocky Mountains. This is the bulk of the mountains that can be found basically just east of the Great Basin. So most of Idaho, a lot of Montana, some of Wyoming, a lot of Utah, and a lot of Colorado, though it does extend down through Arizona and New Mexico as well. As these are mountains, they look like mountains. So in this case, this is the middle of Utah. We have a lot of mountains. It's not as dry as the Great Basin, but it is still relatively dry just for being in the western half of the US, and there are just a ton of mountains. This is a more extreme example. This is right outside Salt Lake City, which in this case you can see a lot of snow-capped mountains in the distance. And another view here in Montana. Again, just more mountains, pretty much all around. There are some sections where you only see them in one direction, but if you're in the heart of the Rockies, they will be all around you. Into the southwestern part of the country, which for the purposes of this is mostly just going to be Arizona, New Mexico, and western Texas. In this example, we have New Mexico. The architecture here is pretty similar across the state. This is traditional Pueblo architecture, which can be seen throughout the entire state. I did say this would be mostly Arizona and New Mexico. I'm also including southern Utah as well. Southern Utah especially, and most of the northern parts of Arizona and Mexico, have a lot of these very flat-topped rock formations, such as these. This region specifically is near Moab, Utah, which is in the eastern half of the state. And this is just a view of the dryness of the region. So this is a section in Arizona. Again, some hills, some mountains, as we are kind of in the Rockies still. I wouldn't say there's as many mountains as the Great Basin, but there are still some. And if you're familiar with how Mexico looks, because we're so close to Mexico, this does look like the northern half of the country. A final view of the southwestern part of the country. This is a less mountainous area, just generally dry, not a lot of foliage, kind of just looks like a desert. On to Texas. So Texas is the largest state excluding Alaska in the country, and there is a lot to it. The main indicator that you're in Texas is this kind of speckled or peppery concrete on the roads. So as you can see here, this pavement just has a lot of coloring to it. You can find this in other states as well, but it is most common in Texas. Again, Texas has the wider yellow lines, as can be seen here as well. Something interesting about Texas is that a lot of its communities use the letters ISD. These letters stand for Independent School District and can be found on places that aren't just schools. Again, a couple other states do use these, but they are very prevalent in Texas across the entire state. As mentioned before, Western Texas has very similar features to New Mexico and Arizona, so a general dry feel, some hills, a couple mountains occasionally like in the extreme western parts, but just a general deserty feel. As you go more south of Texas, closer to the Mexico border, you do pick up some color in the trees. It is still relatively flat and dry, and again here, just kind of flat. This one's not as dry, it is a lot more green than the deserts, but this is still the south. You will also probably see some Spanish here as well, just because of the proximity to the Mexican border. This is the Gulf Coast of Texas, in this case Galveston, which is just south of Houston. It, like California, just has a lot of palm trees, is very flat because you're so close to the sea level, and just kind of feels like the coast. This is South Padre Island, which is much more south, but still on the Gulf Coast. We have plenty of palm trees, basically no elevation. Sometimes you can just see the ocean, but the main indicator, much like the rest of the coast of the country, is just palm trees. Next we have the hill country of Texas. This is roughly west of San Antonio, west of Austin, kind of around that region. This is, like its namesake, pretty hilly. You do have a lot of this sand. A lot of the trees are not super large, but not very small like you would see in the desert. And it is kind of the interim between a lot of the state and the western half, which is desert. Another view of the hill country here. This time we actually do have some hills in the background. Similar looking trees as before. Not really forested, not really desert, just kind of right in the middle. You will also see this live oak tree in both the hill country and a lot of Texas, as well as a lot of the US South. It is basically just a very large, wide tree with a ton of branches. So I-35 connects Dallas and Fort Worth via I-35 east and west, down through Waco, down through Austin, and to San Antonio. While a lot of the population of the state does live in Houston, which is in the southeastern part of the state, a lot of the population also lives in these four major cities. So, the I-35 corridor consists of I-35, which is the main highway here. But other than that, the features are generally flat, not a lot of mountains or hills, kind of the same foliage that we were seeing in the hill country, but it is a lot less dry. Finally, for Texas, we have the eastern part of the state. This kind of blends in with the US South, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But generally, we do have larger trees. In this case, we have some pines, which we will again talk about in more detail later, and just the lower lying houses. Much more green than previously seen, basically no deserty vibes or anything. Kind of just feels like the South, I suppose. A relatively quick one here because a lot of it looks the same, which is unfortunate because of how large it is. We have the Great Plains. So, for my interpretation of the Great Plains, we'll be looking at the top part of Texas, most of Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and eastern Colorado. That's a lot of the country that basically looks the same. The Great Plains are very flat. In this case, very flat, maybe a little bit more dry than we have seen before in places like eastern Texas, but overall very, very flat. If you're familiar with Canada, this is basically what Saskatchewan looks like, except it just is the entire middle part of the country. Another view here in South Dakota, again, very, very flat, really not much going on. Trees kind of just look like trees, really nothing super special to them, normal size and everything. There's not a lot of people that live in the Great Plains, as opposed to places like the East Coast or the South. So you'll get a lot more sparse and just less urban looking places, I would say. Of course, there are urban centers in the Great Plains, but there are much fewer of them as you would see in, say, the Northeast. So up next, we have the American Midwest, which in this case, I will be looking at Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, most of Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and then maybe a little bit of Kentucky and a little bit of Tennessee. If you think of the American Midwest, you probably think of farmland, and you would be correct. There is a lot of farmland in the Midwest. In this case, we have a location in the middle of Wisconsin, where we see just a big field of stuff growing. It's relatively flat. The trees are really not a ton. It is more forested than we saw in Texas or the Great Plains, but probably not as forested or have as tall trees as the Pacific Northwest. However, of course, the entire Midwest is not just farmland. This is a location in central Missouri, which is kind of on the edge of the Ozarks, which is a small mountain range found in northern Arkansas and southern Missouri. This specifically is very close to a lake, which kind of explains why it looks a little bit more southern than most of the Midwest. So for something like this, you could honestly confuse it with a place like Florida or southern Texas or something, especially with these boats here. Going more north into Michigan, we start to see some more of these fir trees. Not the same ones as we were seeing in the Pacific Northwest, but still, they are relatively forested regions. Again, much more green, also pretty flat. Here in Minnesota, we see basically quintessential farmland. We have these huge grain silos along the road. We have train tracks, just a whole farming operation. This is kind of what the Midwest is the bulk of. So relatively rural roads, a lot of farm buildings and farm land. So this is a pretty good indicator that you're in the Midwest. There are 2 states in the country that use letters for their county roads, and they're both found in the Midwest. So this one is Wisconsin, which has the word county on the top and has 1 or 2 letters underneath it, compared to Missouri, which does not have the word county and just has the letter, along with a thicker black border. So if you see a letter road or a letter county road, you're in one of those 2 states, and then you can use the presence of the word county to determine where you are. So I talked a little bit earlier about the American South when talking about eastern Texas. This is a location in Louisiana. I would say the defining feature of the American South is the presence of these southern pines. I believe officially they are loblolly pines, but basically everyone calls them southern pines. They are pine trees with, at the top, much wider branches, and kind of the ends of the branches, the actual pine needle sections, they point up more or less to the sky, as opposed to the other pines that we were seeing in the Northwest and the north parts of the country. Again, this is a location in the middle of Mississippi, and these pines are pretty much just everywhere. There are some non-southern pines here, but again, there are just plenty. These ones are, there are just a lot of them all over. So you can use these as a pretty good indicator that you're in the South. Though they are not exclusively in the South, this is a distribution map of where you will find them. So we have eastern Texas, most of Louisiana, roughly except where the Mississippi River is and like the very swampy parts of it are. Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, but it does also creep up the East Coast up into southern Delaware even. So just because you see them, it doesn't mean you are in the South, but it is more often than not that you are. They do also go into northern Florida and creep a little bit into the central parts. This is something interesting. This is the extreme South Louisiana. We have these houses on stilts here. This is because we are so close to the ocean and there is a pretty high risk of flooding. So the houses are elevated. We can see it a little bit here. This house is on cinder blocks, as well as the one down here. It is mostly just a precaution against flooding. Though you can also see these along other coasts as well. Something I've noticed in more low-lying areas, so in this case, this is southern Alabama. Because we're near the ocean, a lot of houses do not have basements, and instead just expand wider instead of taller. So later we'll see the Northeast has a lot of tall houses that have basements. Obviously you can't tell if a house has a basement or not just by looking at it, but generally if a house is just very, very wide, it generally only has 1 or 2 floors and does not go any deeper than that. While of course there are wide houses like this all over the country, they are much more prevalent in the South just because it is a lot harder or in some cases impossible to dig a basement. So on to Florida. Florida is also one of the larger states in the country and has a lot of different climates to it as well. Kind of paradoxically, the northern part of Florida is probably the most southern part of Florida, kind of in terms of geographically and also culturally. We have a lot of the southern pines up here in northern Florida. Florida is extremely flat as well. Moving into more central / coastal region, we have more palms here. In this case, this is the northwestern coast, roughly, kind of around the bend of Florida. So it is still very flat. A lot of buildings are very wide. And we do see some southern pines as well, but there are a lot more palms than we had seen before. To speak again on how flat Florida is, the end of this hill, all the way down here, is the highest point in the state that is south of kind of the panhandle part. The actual highest point in the state is effectively on the border with Alabama, but this hill can be found in central Florida and is actually the highest point in the state. It's only 330-ish feet tall, so if you see elevation that is any more than this, you're probably not in Florida. Another good indicator of Florida and also the American South is this Spanish moss. It's very gray, kind of dry stuff just hanging off of trees all over. So in this case, these trees are just covered in them. This is a pretty good indicator of just central southern Florida as well, but can be found elsewhere in the south. So again, looking at, in this case, the eastern coast, this is still somewhat central. This location specifically is a little bit south of Orlando. We just have a lot of palms. There are fewer southern pines. In this case, this one down here kind of is. But the rest are kind of just slowly getting replaced by palm trees. Moving into the heart of Miami, all the way in the south part of Florida, basically every tree is now a palm tree. There are just palm trees everywhere. While this is a city and these are all planted, this is basically what you'll see in the south part of Florida anyways. Up next, we have the Florida Keys, which, as I explained way earlier, are connected to the mainland by Route 1, as you can see here. These basically is just a long bridge between Miami and all of the different keys that are south of Florida. Similar to the south, we have a ton of palms everywhere, and it just has more of an island feel, just because it is basically an island, and probably is even more flat than the rest of Florida. Again, basically every tree has turned into a palm tree just because we are so close to the water. This is one of the smaller keys, specifically Marathon Key, and it is just a very, very flat and palmy area. Moving out of the absolute flatness that is Florida and into the Appalachian region, we basically have northern Georgia, western North Carolina, western Virginia, West Virginia, the middle of Pennsylvania, and a little bit of New York and Vermont, as well as some parts of New Hampshire and Maine. The Appalachians, I would say, are less extreme than the Rockies. You don't really see as many snow-covered or sharp mountains. There are a lot of more rounded, less tall mountains that you can see all over, and are generally very, very forested. So this is a location in West Virginia in the Appalachians, and again, very forested, very roundish mountains, nothing super extreme nearby, just kind of elevation and forests. Despite not being entirely in the Appalachians, West Virginia kind of just looks like this as a whole. It is pretty much just entirely forest, and between the Appalachians and just the other terrain in West Virginia, just the rolling hills all around, the whole state is fairly recognizable just for being so covered in trees. West Virginia also has a unique state road or county road symbol here. So as you can see, there are two roads separated by a line, kind of looks like a fraction. You will only see this in West Virginia. Moving on to the Vermont section of the Appalachian Mountains. Like the rest of them, really, you have these rounded mountains, fairly forested, and really nothing too extravagant about it. One other thing for signs is that in Kentucky, you will see a 4-digit road sign occasionally, with the number in an oval. These are pretty much the only state that has 4-digit roads. You will see 4-digit road signs in Texas and Louisiana as well, though both of those state signs have the shape of the state on them, so they really can't be confused with these Kentucky ones. Virginia has similar road signs to this, with number in an oval basically, but their numbers do not go into the 4 digits, with I believe one single exception, which is like State Road 5000, I believe. But generally, you'll have higher numbers, so some go into the 600s, but they shouldn't get into the 4 digits in Virginia. On to the East Coast now, which for the purposes of this section is going to be everything from southern Georgia all the way up to and including New Jersey. Because of the lack of terrain, this is unfortunately another region that kind of all just looks the same. This is eastern North Carolina, and it kind of just looks like the South again, even though it's not really as southern as some other locations. We do have the presence of some southern pines again. It is very flat and forested, and I'm sure you've already heard this 20 times. I did want to mention again that you do still see Spanish moss in places that are not Florida. In this case, this is coastal South Carolina, where we have a lot of the Spanish moss and some southern pines as well. Like I mentioned earlier when talking about the southern architecture, the East Coast and also the Northeast has more taller buildings. These kind of push the colonial architecture. We'll see better examples of that later. But we have houses with pillars in front, these like turrets with windows, things like that. They're less wide and less one level than a lot of the South. But again, as always, you will still see examples of those. I did want to make a note here of how interesting, I would say, New Jersey is. So this is New Jersey. If I was given this location without seeing anything else, I would probably go like Wisconsin or Iowa or something. But this is just southern New Jersey, especially as evidenced by this very yellow license plate, which is one of the most identifiable ones. But New Jersey, especially the southern part, has a lot of farmland, despite what you may think about New Jersey. However, the state also has sections that look like this, which is basically just a northeastern state, because it is. Again, this is one where you need to use a lot of clues, just because this state has a lot of distinct features to it. It's kind of hard to get in a vacuum, so you probably need to at least look at some license plates, just because they're so easy to see, and possibly use some other clues to determine that you are in New Jersey. One last thing for New Jersey is this location. Again, this is the coast. It really doesn't look like either New Jersey or the coast. I could see this being maybe coastal Nova Scotia in Canada, if not for the other clues. New Jersey is one of the harder states to both get and region guess, I would say, if not for things like license plates, but just giving a view without any other obvious clues, it is fairly difficult. On to the state of New York. New York is probably the most identifiable in terms of license plates, though as coverage gets newer, it may be harder to tell. So we have this orange plate with black corners on the side. This was the New York license plate. As of a couple of years ago, it was replaced with a more generic, in terms of blur, white one. New York City is also a very easy city to identify. You obviously have the plates, but the city as a whole is more densely packed. We have these long-running roads, just a lot of large buildings, and just kind of what you would expect New York City to look like. Just a very busy place. Moving north from New York City, we have the Hudson Valley, which is the section in the Hudson River without much elevation. This is mostly characterized by older architecture and just generally either hilly or flat areas. This is generally part of the Northeast, so we'll start seeing a lot older architecture here. A good rule of thumb is if the building looks like it was made in the 1700s, it probably was. It was probably here for the colonial times of the country, so it's most likely in the Northeast. Another example of the Hudson Valley is here. We start seeing the Northeast, in which a lot of it is mostly just forested and not flat, but not mountainous. There's just a lot of hills. This is kind of just a typical northeastern US round. In the very north part of New York, we have the Adirondack Mountains, which are different than the Appalachians, but kind of similar in terms of what it looks like in general. So this road runs right through them, and it kind of looks similar to what you'd see in the Pacific Northwest, although the trees are different. They're less tall than we saw in Washington, but I believe they're a different type of fir. So something like this you would see in places like northern New York and Vermont, and kind of just regions like that. Like I mentioned earlier, if the architecture looks like it was built 300 years ago, it probably was. These are great examples of that in the Northeast. We have this very old church building, a very old building attached to it, this rocky building. This is kind of just a lot of the northeastern rounds. This case is in New York as well, but it is closer to Connecticut and Massachusetts. This location in Connecticut just has a lot of colonial architecture, which is pretty well characterized by just flat, very flat front of the house or building, pretty flat windows, a lot of pillars out front, Again, fairly tall and not as wide as, say, somewhere in the south. All the way up now in northern Maine, I noticed that a couple of the towns have this flag on them. It's not the French flag, but it is the Acadia flag. This is also something that is seen in places like Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada, as well as some parts of Quebec. You may see this in Maine as well. So it is kind of hard to categorize the US because a lot of it just looks the same. So the East Coast kind of just looks the same all the way up. The Northeast looks very similar. The same cannot be said about Alaska. Alaska is extremely distinct from the rest of the country. In this case, we have very, very sharp and snowy mountains, very rocky terrain nearby, as well as a pretty well abundance of forest. Alaska also just feels cold. Maybe it's just the more drab colors, like the gray on the side of the road and like the less developed trees. You kind of just feel like you were in Alaska most of the time anyways. That being said, Alaska is not all just snowy mountains. This is in Anchorage, which is one of the more populated places of Alaska. There really aren't that many anyways. But you could possibly get this confused with the Pacific Northwest, just because we have just forested mountains here, and a lot of the trees kind of look similar to what you would see up there as well. A lot of the more rural roads in Alaska kind of just look like this. Not entirely paved or slightly paved, just very muddy. A lot of smaller, thinner trees. This is a good indicator that you're very north on Earth anyways. The more north you go, the thinner the trees get, and it just feels pretty desolate. The northernmost official coverage in Alaska is in Prudhoe Bay. In this case, there's just a lot of mud everywhere. There is some civilization, but not a lot. Basically no trees and no terrain otherwise. It is pretty flat, pretty muddy, very, very gray, and is just, again, very, very desolate. I did mention before that you can see some Gen 2 still in Alaska. This is one of those cases. This could pretty easily be confused with the Yukon Territory or northern British Columbia. That is basically because this is very close to the Canadian border. It is officially the US and it is Alaska, but you do see Gen 2 here and some other less covered areas of the state. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of Alaska is not well covered, so we have locations such as Anchorage and Fairbanks, which are the main population centers of the state anyways. Those are well covered, along with this one road that brings you all the way up to Prudhoe Bay, all the way and the very north part of the state. It is not the most northern civilization in the state, that is all the way up here, but is currently only covered in unofficial coverage. You do also have some coverage down here in the southern peninsula part of the state, so places like Juneau and Skagway and Sitka and Ketchikan. These areas specifically do look a lot like British Columbia, just because they are so close. So in this case, we are in Juneau. The mountains are very similar to those you'll see in Canada, because they're the same mountains. But in some cases, you can use the Gen 3 car blur, or the license plates, or just other signs to determine that you are in the US. Finally, the last state to cover here is Hawaii. Hawaii is a volcanic state located in the Pacific, and that is well represented by just the sheer amount of mountains that you'll see here as well. Occasionally in Hawaii, you will see this antenna. You do see this antenna in places like Cambodia as well, but you will get that in the less covered parts of Hawaii. This is the now infamous grid of Hawaii, where 20 pro players went Hawaii on Idaho, because it looked like this. It is a very grid-based area in the main island of Hawaii, and is categorized by these volcanic rocks all around, and just very foggy coverage as well. The grid is down in the south of the main island, and is just a grid. You do also have some more flat areas in Hawaii like this one, but you're pretty much always near a mountain, and typically also near the ocean, just because a lot of the islands are fairly small. A lot of the population centers are near the ocean. One final major tip that I want to share is that billboards are banned in a couple states, so these being Maine, Vermont, Alaska, and Hawaii. You will never see a billboard on the side of the road. This is mostly important for highway coverage or interstates. If you see one, you'll never be in those states. So, as a whole, the US is fairly easy to identify, but one of the hardest to actually region guess. I did a good amount of hand waving, which I didn't really want to do, but a lot of the country just looks the same. And I didn't really want to make a 16-hour video going over every single state and all the minutia for it. If you're interested in learning more about the country, the next major steps, I would say, kind of similar to Canada, would just be learning the major cities in each state, possibly the capitals and or maybe the top couple in terms of population. Area codes are a lot harder to learn in the US as opposed to Canada, just because there are so many more. Some cities in the US have multiple area codes. Some states do have one area code for the entire state. So for example, North Dakota has 701 as its area code. Delaware and Washington, D.C. both have 302. So some places like that are more learnable than others. License plates, again, are something that are pretty good to learn. Again, some are more learnable than others. A lot are just white, but some have some pretty identifiable features. As well as the state-specific road signs, a lot of these are easy. The harder ones are probably the couple that share the same design. So, for example, the Massachusetts and Connecticut and Maine ones are all numbered in a square, so those aren't very helpful in distinguishing between the three, but at least knowing that you're narrowing it down to those three is pretty helpful. The two main guides that I want to highlight here are, of course, the Plunkett guide. This is one of the more developed guides that Plunkett has put together, again, just because the US is so large. And again, it covers a lot of what I talked about today, such as, Gen 2 being very rare, Gen 1 existing in the country at all, signs being more wordy, things like that. It also goes more into depth as to what you can find in the US and not in Canada, as well as going the distance to tell you which stores can be found in which regions. So for example, you'll only see H-E-B in Texas. If you are extremely dedicated and need to know every single thing about the country, this guide, States of the US by JLess, is probably the most comprehensive guide I've seen for a single country thus far. It goes through basically every single landscape type and what can be found there in terms of vegetation. So for example, the Appalachian oak forests contain all of these flowers and all of these trees, which is different from the oak hickory pine forest, etc., etc. Something that I did not mention in this guide is power poles, just because there are really no unique power poles. There are maybe a couple, but compared to Canada, where sometimes you see the same power pole type for a whole given province, you basically don't get that in the US. However, this guide does go through them. So for example, this type of power pole you'll see in these 7 states, this one you'll see in these states, and so on. It does eventually go on into a breakdown of each state. So for example, in Alabama, you'll see these utility poles, you'll see these T-intersection signs, these bollards. Bollards is also something that are very difficult to determine in the US just because there are a lot of them, as well as things like sign stickers, the chevron type, and the guardrails that you find in each state. So if you are extremely dedicated in learning the country, this is a fantastic guide for that. So that is it for the United States of America. If I missed anything obvious or missed any obvious region with some easy tells, please let me know and describe it in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel. I am, again, trying to go for every single country that can be found on GeoGuessr, which is a huge undertaking, so we'll get there. Up next is Mexico, and then from there it should get a bit easier down into South America until Brazil, which will be a video probably just as long as this one. Thank you, as always, for watching, and I'll see you soon.